25 to 30 to 40% increase in growth rate. Cattle gaining 4 pounds a day, that's a pound a day. And if you look, you can visually see that difference in a pen of cattle that have been on feed for even 50 or 100 days. So it's remarkable.
Welcome to another episode of the Beef Podcast Show. My name is Dr. Stephanie Hansen. I'm a feedlot nutritionist at Iowa State University, and it is my pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues and friends from the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State, Dr. Dan Loy. He is a university professor of animal science at Iowa State University and director of the Iowa Beef Center. He has also served as an extension beef specialist for Iowa since 1982. Giving leadership to ISU's program in the cattle feeding industry. His research interests have focused on applied feedlot nutrition and beef production and management systems. He also is an instructor for our capstone Advanced Beef Systems Management course. He has a BS from Western Illinois and his PhD from Penn State. So welcome to the show, Dr. Loy.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, this is kind of fun. He asked me yesterday if we were going to be recording in adjoining offices because our offices are next to each other in Kildee Hall there on campus. And I said, no, Fridays are work from home for me. So I'm recording from my sunroom and he's recording from his office.
Usually when you're on a webinar, I can hear you through the walls. So it probably would have been bouncing off the walls.
Absolutely. Those walls are thin. You can hear everybody. I can hear people 4 or 5 offices down like they're in my office. Okay, well, Dr. Loy has given a lot of leadership to the beef industry from the hallowed halls of Kildee Hall and Iowa State University's campus. So I thought maybe that would be a good place to start. Tell us a little bit about your journey that led to your position there today, Dan.
It's kind of a short story. When I graduated from Penn State with my PhD, I applied for a couple jobs, and I was offered this one. And that was the first and only job that I've ever had.
I think we can all aspire to that, right? To have that one application, that one interview, and get the job and call it good. So, excellent.
Well, I don't know. I just if I had to do it again, I don't know if I'd get the job. So I don't know.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background that led you to your interest in beef feedlot, right? So you're an Illinois boy originally. So maybe start there with some of the influence of your growing up on a family farm.
Yeah, well, the farm I grew up on was a farm that would be pretty typical of the 1960s in Western Illinois, even Iowa. Very diversified. We had cattle. We had a beef cow herd, had hogs. They were the mortgage lifter. Had a diversified crop rotation: corn, oats, hay, corn, and beans was the rotation, and that was very typical. I had no idea that I was going to go to college, so I was going to go back and farm. That was kind of assumed, and I came to the realization that with the farm that we had, for me to come back and farm, we would have to expand. And probably the only way that I would be able to stay on the farm would be to go into confinement hogs. And I really didn't like the hogs. They paid the bills, but I liked cattle better. My grandfather was a cattle feeder. And so that was how my interest came into cattle feeding. So I actually enrolled for college and signed up for classes on the same day, 5 days before classes started, and went to Blackhawk East Junior College first. And that's what got me started down the path of going to college. 10 years later, I was still in college and hadn't gotten a job yet. And my dad asked me if I was ever going to get one.
Did he think you were going to be a perpetual student?
I think so. He wondered about that.
I think we all get that look, or they think we're vets. If we go to graduate school to animal science, I still get the grandparents who are like, so you're like a vet or a vet in training? It's like, no.
Yeah, that's right. I got that.
So tell us a little bit about your research that you did for your graduate work at Penn State, because I think it's really some of the foundational work in this particular field, and that maybe will lead us to some of the work that you and I have been collaborating on more recently.
That was an interesting journey too, because I had no intention of going to graduate school, and my livestock judging team coach and Erskine Cash, who was the judging team coach at Penn State, decided I was going to go and be a teaching assistant there. So I went there to help teach beef production class, and my office was in the lab of Dr. Harold Harpster, who had just come out of, he was brand new assistant professor, had just come out of the lab of Danny Fox, and they were working on the early versions of the Cornell model at that time to predict growth in cattle. And he had done the research that looked at basically was the predecessor of the adjustments that go into the frame size adjustments in the NRC model as it is today. And so we decided that my research would look at the area of growth implants and how they affect how they would fit into that particular model. So I started in a master's program and actually applied for a grant with Syntex at the time, was the company that owns Synovex. Interestingly, I think there's 34 or 37 implants available today, and there were 2 then. And then while I was there, then Compudos was cleared. But at that time, there were Rowgrow and Synovex. So I had done the first study with Rowgrow and applied for a grant with Synovex and got that grant approved. So basically, I kind of rolled into a PhD program. And so my research was, I think the title of my thesis was a characterization of growth in feedlot cattle based on implants or something to that effect. So what we did was, just prior to that, there had been research at Texas Tech with DES where they had followed cattle through to maturity and found that with cattle that were implanted with DES actually had a larger mature size than cattle that were not implanted. So we went about characterizing skeletal growth. So we measured different parts of the animal's anatomy, body length, height, circumference of heart girth circumference, height at the hip and the shoulders. Interestingly, we actually branded the cattle to have reference points so that we could make accurate measurements, which probably wouldn't be approved by IACUC today. But so we demonstrated that implants would increase skeletal growth. We looked at different measures of body composition and characterized the lean and fat growth curves of cattle that with and without implants. And then the other part was a little more basic. We followed a group of cattle through and measured growth hormone. Growth hormone's episodic, so we collected blood samples every 15 minutes for 9 hours, and then looked at the number of growth hormone peaks, the area under the curve, and characterized the fact that that estrogen implants do increase growth hormone secretion. We also collected the pituitaries and demonstrated that the pituitaries were larger and had more growth hormone in them, which supported some of the work that actually Alan Trankel had been doing with DES prior to that. So it was kind of a very broad-based study of implants at the time.
Yeah, but a lot of really good pieces there, thinking about the skeletal growth and the growth hormone tie-ins. So you mentioned DES. So if our listeners aren't aware, that would be diethylstilbestrol. And so tell us a little bit. So it's kind of funny, right, that you ended up at Iowa State with this background in implants, because Iowa State and the Department of Animal Science have a long history in the implant field, right, going back to DES. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that story?
Well, your predecessor's predecessor, Dr. Wise Burroughs. So would that make him your grandfather, your research grandfather, or something?
I guess,
like that?
Or my office grandfather, because I think my research grandfather is Spears's advisor, right?
True, yeah. So he was one of the pioneers in the first to roll out diethylstilbestrol as a growth stimulant, the first steroidal estrogen-based growth stimulant that was used to stimulate growth in feed cattle or in feedlot cattle. Actually, when he rolled that out, the Cattle Feeders Day, he had over 1,000 people attend that year. And it was held at, if you're familiar with our campus, so it's C.Y. Stevens Auditorium and packed the house. And so that was a very interesting discovery. And that's not the only discovery that Dr. Burroughs did, was known for, but one of the more notable ones.
Sure. Metabolizable protein would be one of the other ones, right?
Metabolizable protein and in vitro fermentation is another one that he pioneered. And interestingly about this is that the Eli Lilly was the first to merchandise DES and actually spun off a new company from Eli Lilly called Elanco that was developed just to market DES. So that's another interesting little tidbit that we like to make sure our grad students know before they leave this place.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got some foundational work that occurred at Iowa State with figuring out that these estrogenic compounds were stimulating growth, and then you've got some follow-up work a couple decades later talking about that going further down that path to say yes, in fact, these estrogenic compounds are stimulating growth hormone and tying that back to pituitary. So it's interesting now to think about kind of where our work has continued to evolve, and you kind of hinted at this. So you talked about noting the increase in skeletal growth in implanted animals, right? So they have this difference in frame score and stuff, right? Which is why in implanted cattle, we can finish them at a heavier weight because they don't get ahead of us on yield discounts and things like that. They don't get too fat for their frame because they put frame on. So I study minerals, and Dr. Loy is interested in implants and kind of energetics and body composition. And I don't even really remember how this conversation started, but one day we were sitting around, I think we were both on Emma Niedermeyer's graduate committee for her master's degree. And we were like, I wonder if the mineral requirements of implanted cattle are different. And so in the beef industry, that some of the consultants survey would suggest that a lot of folks actually supplement trace minerals, for example, at 2 to 3 times what the beef NRC would actually recommend. So maybe they feed 90 parts per million of supplemental zinc instead of the 30 parts per million that the beef NRC would recommend. And thus was born Emma's thesis work, right? So she was the OG of, because we've done a lot of work on this in the last 8 years since then, but Emma was the OG and did a study where we had cattle that received no implant or received a TEIS, so kind of a moderate potency implant, followed by a TE200, so a higher potency in a about 130-day study. And we fed them either no supplemental trace minerals, fed NRC, or fed these industry concentrations that were 2 to 3 times higher. And I was so surprised that in both our non-implanted and our implanted cattle, those animals that we fed the higher amounts of trace minerals to had heavier hot carcasses, better gains, and slightly better feed efficiency. And that really took us down this whole path of studies that we've done since 2016, trying to figure out how do we optimize the nutrition of the implanted animal. So, you've been on a lot of our students' graduate committees and stuff like that. So, and I feel like you've got a unique perspective of kind of understanding, kind of where the implant research has gone. So I'm curious what your observations are and kind of how we've gone from using implants to being more strategic with them. And then I'd like us to get into some conversation too about, how do you help producers understand the best way to use implants?
A couple of things. When I did my research, the only implants that were available were the estrogen implants, and I think the growth hormone impact. We know that like growth hormone will increase skeletal growth and increase muscle growth and has those effects. But in the 1990s, then enter the androgen implants or TBA, and those combinations really allow, since they work differently, the response is additive. I think in Emma's study with the negative control, which is unusual. Most of the implant companies that fund research, it's brand X versus brand Y. And so we don't often have that negative control because it costs money to have that. But in her study, those cattle gained, I think, close to 40% more than the controls. which is a remarkable increase. And so not only does that affect the major nutrient requirements, protein, energy, and so forth, but it just stands to reason, especially since, minerals like zinc are associated with lean growth, that those would be increased as well. And so there, a lot of those studies, I think when you talk about this or the idea coming about Emma's research, I think really what you did was bust into my office and say, Dan, I've got an idea. And so there were a lot of moments like that. Is this related to beta agonists? What about other trace minerals? And so, it just opened kind of a Pandora's box to a lot of more questions than answers, and, a whole line of research.
Yeah, I'm laughing pretty hard here because I feel called out. I definitely have ideation in my top 10, and everybody around me has learned to take it with a grain of salt when I bust into their office and say, I have an idea, because I might have another idea in 5 minutes. But yeah, that one was a good one. That's been really fun. So I kind of like to think about it too as the nutritional requirements. And I think as a part of that is the management practices that includes the implants or the beta agonist of the modern feedlot animal, right? How do we make this beast be as productive and efficient as we can and be able to use our resources the best? And, of all the things that we have available at our disposal, would you agree that implants are one of the best returns on investment in terms of use of resources and efficiency?
In terms of technologies that improve efficiency, and in terms of return on investment, I don't think there's another one that's even close. When we start talking about, 25 to 30 to 40% increase in growth rate, cattle gaining 4 pounds a day, that's a pound a day. And if you look, you can visually see that difference in a pen of cattle that have been on feed for even a 50 or 100 days. So it's remarkable. And as you mentioned, I've been talking about implants and strategies and implant programs with producers for 40 years now, and it doesn't get any simpler. We have producers that are chasing grid markets. There's concerns about implants having negative effects on carcass quality, and so producers are concerned about that and maybe want to be more conservative than necessary. And so trying to develop an implant strategy where you can capitalize on that growth response and still not affect your carcass quality at the end is one of the things that we've been concentrating on recently. I like to say that implants are probably the most studied tool that we have on the planet. But there are some things about implants that most of the studies are designed to measure growth rate and feed conversion, and so we may see negative impacts on carcass quality just because of the way that the studies are designed, and so that's one of the areas that we've been spending a lot of time on recently.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I definitely credit you being a member of our team for the fact that we were able to do quite a few studies where we implanted and did not implant cattle, and we could kill them on the same number of days on feed. And that was because we, on average, would have had them on terminal implant for about 90 days. So our most potent, highest TBA content implant, they were only on that for about 90 days. And I think that was really your suggestion, right? That we needed to manage those number of days on that most potent implant. And we needed to have those cattle to a certain degree of finish before we were able to go to that. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that and how producers, because I like your comment of like, if you're going for a grid versus if you're just trying to sell in the beef, like that you might have different goals in mind.
Well, one of the things we learned through the years, and I think this kind of came out from two different sources. One was from all of the research that was done at Iowa State in the development of the ultrasound technology. And then also with the Robbie Pritchard's lab in South Dakota, Kelly Bruns did a serial slaughter that confirmed this as well. And that's that marbling is developed at a different rate than external fat. Marbling is fairly linear. It's a slower developing tissue, and it starts earlier. whereas external fat is exponential, and we can put that on very quickly. So if we save that aggressive implant until later in the feeding period, a lot of the marbling has already been developed, and the external fat will come later. And so we can have a less negative effect on carcass quality, if any, if we would be more aggressive earlier, or we do something that restricts the animal's ability to grow and marble earlier in life. Because of the way marbling's developed, it just doesn't have time to catch up. And so that's the strategy that we've been, that we've been talking about, that I encouraged you to incorporate into a lot of the studies that you've done.
Right. So one of the challenges, like that you mentioned there too, has been when implant studies compared days on feed versus harvesting at a similar body composition. And it feels like there's been a lot more of the trying to harvest at a similar body composition than on the same days on feed because of this challenge. So what do you think we need to keep in mind as we're designing projects in the future?
And that statement you just said, I think a few years ago wasn't true. They were all the same number of days on feed. And actually some of the earlier work on that was Pete Anderson's thesis work at the University of Minnesota. He found that with the implants that were available at that time, which are fewer than are available now, that for cattle to be to the same body composition needed to be fed about 10 to 15 days longer. And so that kind of set up people being conscious of trying to market at the same external fat. And with implants, that may be more days on feed. I think today we're seeing them more at a constant days on feed because with the current implants, the responses are so much greater in growth rate that they tend to be more equalized in terms of body composition.
Gotcha. So implants are maybe going to undergo some changes here in 2023 in terms of the way that we can use them. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about some of the new regulation guidance that's coming down starting in June of 23?
Yeah, so the FDA put out a guidance that basically indicates that with implants, unless it says specifically on the label that within a production phase, there will be no reimplanting, unless it says that specifically in the label. And so the good news is we've got some long duration implants out there, and the average number of days on feed for feedlot cattle in the U.S. is about 200 days. And so there are a couple implants out there that are 200-day implants that are combination implants that are very good. So they would fit in those programs. Where it gets to be a little more challenging in the feedlot would be, for lighter weight cattle that are in a growing finishing program where where they might be on feed for 250, 300 days. With those, they would either need to use the implants that are specifically labeled for reimplant or delay implant. And I think that's something we're going to see a lot of research on or more reviews on studies that have been conducted on delayed implanting in the feedlot. Because, like we just talked about, implanting early is less effective than implanting later.
Yeah. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but, a lot of the stuff that's been done with any kind of delay, it's really been more about how do we get the caloric intake on those calves up to the level that we want to have, right? So they're more in the lightweights, kind of calves, or, maybe if it's yearlings coming in off of grass that we wait until we've got them up on a decent grain intake. But it's going to be interesting times, right, to see how people handle some of the new guidance. But if folks weren't aware of it, that's good for them to hear about.
Right. And now, just to be clear, within a production phase, so, a cow-calf production, you can implant. There's 3 products that are labeled for calves on the cow, and they'll increase the weaning weight 30 to 40 pounds. And then when they go to a stalker or a backgrounding program, they can be implanted again. But then once they arrive at the final feedlot phase, they unless it's labeled, they can only use the one implant during that phase.
Yeah, and I think one of the big evolutions you talked about going from things like DES to just estrogenic compounds to the combination estrogenic and TBA compounds, and then now having the long-lasting ones where some of the pellets are coated so that they don't, start to release that hormone until a later number of days. Probably some of the people that are really going to have to figure out what to do with this are those that feed Holsteins or other things that are on feed for 5 years.
Right, and that's gonna be the challenge. And there is one implant that has been labeled for reimplant that would fit that scenario, but it kind of with the other implants that are out there, basically would be looking at kind of saving that. And I'd like to when I've talked about strategic implant programs with producers, I always say, and it's a little bit like a broken record, that the most important implant is the last one that you own when you own the cattle. And if you get that one timed right, you're going to get most of the response that you would get otherwise. It may not be 100%, but you'll get a lot of the response. And so I think that's what we're going to need to be working on, is getting that last implant that you have in your toolbox timed at the appropriate time before market.
Yeah. So I guess maybe just to wrap up a little bit of the implant conversation, some of the findings of the work that we've done together over the last 6 or 7 years would really suggest that for things like zinc, that likely is supporting protein synthesis, lean muscle accretion, that those implants are really driving, that, feeding greater than what the NRC recommends is probably giving us some of our best performance. We're investigating manganese right now. We've got a trial going on with that. I think the one that I don't really love the higher recommendation is copper. Elizabeth Messersmith did a couple of studies while she was here looking at some different copper statuses in finishing cattle and looking at different implant strategies with those, both in heifers and steers. And really in both of those studies, we saw that feeding that higher industry concentration of copper, which would be 20 parts per million versus the NRC at 10 parts per million, had some negative effects on the implant response. And I think that that's because there's some estrogen responses on some of the copper transporters. And so I think those implanted animals might actually just be a little bit more efficient with copper than we want them to be. And that ruminant liver just soaks up that copper. So that is one where I don't love the, more is better kind of attitude that sometimes we get with some of the things like trace minerals. But I think for some of the other ones, especially thinking things like the zinc, we're on the right track there to feed more than what the NRC recommends to capture the growth potential that these animals have. Maybe just any other thoughts on implants from any other studies you've seen from other institutions or anything where, you thought, well, that's kind of a interesting thing to think about from our implant management, or, some of these ones that have maybe looked at more, you've maybe tell us a little bit more about some of the work you've done with the McNay herd. So you and Erica Lundy have done some beef checkoff supported work, really digging into this marbling question, right?
Right. That McNay herd is a herd that's been selected for marbling. Actually, initially it was using ultrasound. It predated EPDs for marbling. So the early selection was with marbling or intermuscular fat ultrasound selection. And so those cattle it's not at all unusual for them to grade from 50 to 80% prime for a group of cattle from that. And so we've gotten a couple, actually we're on our third study that we've had funded from the Iowa Beef Industry Council, looking at, well, let me take a step back. Yes, that group, that herd is very highly marbled and has a genetic potential, but the Angus breed and a lot of other breeds have increased their marbling significantly. So there are other herds out there that have that kind of potential. So the question is that we're interested in is how much technology can we apply to those cattle and not screw them up? We noticed, we did a few meetings, extension meetings around the state on managing and feeding cattle for high quality. And we noticed that some of the producers that were chasing that were, marketing cattle that were, 80, 90% prime, were feeding them very slowly with a very low energy ration, and for the most part, not using implants for the fear that they would, negatively affect the carcass quality. So we looked at, how aggressive could we be with our implant program? And then we looked at different energy levels. One, I think we went down as low as a 58, 57 or 58 megacal and compared that to a 64, 65, which would be more typical of what we would be feeding here in the upper Midwest. And what we found was that we can use a lot of technology and get growth, and get good growth response from those cattle without negatively affecting carcass quality. And again, it goes back to implant timing. And actually on the energy level, we actually got higher marbling on the cattle that we fed the higher energy, which, would make sense. There's kind of a theory that if you feed them low and slow, I think it goes back to how Wagyu cattle are fed for the Kobe beef in Japan, that, they have a threshold daily gain and then feed them forever and ever. But part of that is genetic as well. So that's been some work that we're working on. We're going to start a study in a couple weeks here where we'll try to do the same thing with the heifers and see if we can replicate with the heifers from that herd.
Nice. Yeah, that herd is such an interesting group. Somebody said one time, well, I'm pretty sure that they're prime the day we wean them. And I'm not sure it's that much of an exaggeration.
So we've done a lot of ultrasound with those cattle. It's not at all unusual for them to be choice when you wean them.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So let's transition out of implants and talk a little bit about maybe current feed prices. I think we would agree that that's one of the biggest challenges facing the feeder cattle individual right now would be, and the feedlot person would be the feed prices. So what are your current recommendations as we move into the spring of 23 here to help producers stay on top of feed costs?
We've been talking about this quite a bit, with corn prices $7 to $8. They've moderated a little bit, but still, the question is, we've gone through 3 or 4 decades where the corn price has been between $2 and $4 per bushel. In the last 2 or 3 years, it's been between 5 and 7. So the question is, are we breaking through a new threshold where we'll be dealing with higher feed prices continually into the future? This year, not only is corn high, but with drought nationally, there's a hay shortage. And so forage prices are high as well. And so it's been kind of a perfect storm where feed costs have never been higher than they are today. I think the Kansas Focus on Feedlots that tracks closeouts, their last summary, it was close to $1.50 per pound. And it wasn't that long ago, Steph, that we were looking at, cost of gains that were 70, 80 cents here in Iowa. So it's almost double what it's been. So what we've been talking about with producers in terms of managing feed costs are, first of all, what we've just been talking about, technology. Any technology that improves feed conversion has more value now than it's ever had in history. So the return per dollar invested for things like implants, beta agonists has never been higher than it is right now, especially as cattle prices increase. The other thing that producers sometimes do when feed costs get high is, have them in the feedlot for shorter periods of time. So, heavier cattle coming into the feedlot, that doesn't work that well this year because there's a shortage of forage to grow the cattle in a stocker and backgrounding program. So we haven't seen much of that. And historically, when feed costs get high, we'll market them sooner. But that's complicated with the way cattle are marketed because, if you sell them live, yes, your break even will be lowest at a heavier weight when feed's cheap versus expensive. But we have this issue related to carcass transfer. And so you feed them heavier if you're going to market them on a carcass weight basis. As you feed them heavier, 80 to 85% of the weight is carcass weight. Plus, we have record premiums for CAB and prime beef. So those cattle are probably increasing in value at that time. So marketing sooner may not be the answer. So I think it goes down to being efficient, good bunk management, technology, everything you can do to improve feed conversion, but then also improving the efficiency of feed use before it gets to the feed bunk. Proper feed storage, and feed delivery, trying to minimize feed waste. Just like the feed efficiency, when feed is highest in value, you can spend more money on things like a commodity shed. If you're grinding hay into your bunker silo, you could, on a windy day, I don't know what percent of it blows away, but it's a pretty high percentage. So, blow it into a commodity building. Try to do everything you can to reduce both feeding losses and feed storage losses, which that goes back to proper silage management, feed out management, all of those types of things. So those are the types of things we've been talking about in terms of trying to deal with these high feed costs.
So I think a lot of the topics that you just mentioned, bunk management, feed processing, feed storage, things like that, those would all be topics that you guys probably cover in your feedlot short course every year?
Yeah, it is, especially the bunk management. We spend a lot of time on that. We and I'm not sure where I heard this, but I stole it from someone. But the idea that there's 4 rations in the feedlot. There's the one that you formulate as a nutritionist. There's the one that actually goes into the feed wagon, and historically, and these new technologies that integrate the scale head with the feed wagon have really improved that, because there was a bias when you're using an end loader to put modified or wet distiller's grains that you always overcompensate because that one chunk falls into the feed wagon. So that's improved that. You can actually grade your whoever's loading the feeds wagon or mixer on that issue. But then there's what actually gets delivered. And that's one of the things we talk about in the feedlot short course, is evaluating mixing. And so we use Penn State particle separator to calculate coefficient of variation on the load as it's being unloaded, to look at how well the particle size is, how uniform the particle size is from the beginning to the end of the load. And then the fourth one is what the cattle actually eat. And so that's where we get into selectivity and mixing order to try to make sure that your ration stays together and that type of thing.
So the short course that you host, tell us a little bit more about some of the logistics on that. That's usually in August.
Yeah, it's in August. This year, we're going to change it up a little bit. Historically, it's been here in Ames and both here on campus, and then we go out to Kowser's feedlot. This year, we're going to move it to Southwest Iowa and try that. We've done it for 6 years consecutive. Last year was the first year we didn't fill up. So we had a couple open seats. So we're going to try to move it around a little bit. So we're going to shorten it up by about a half a day. And then we're going to hold it down in Southwest Iowa at our Armstrong Research Farm and utilize a local feedlot down there as well.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I always run into random people at different meetings. They'll be like, oh yeah, I've been to your short course, or I heard Robbie come and preach on the merits of bunk scoring and things like that. So I know you get lots of good feedback from that meeting.
Yeah, it's been a good program.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things I wanted to make sure I got a chance to visit with you here about today was that, I introduced you as my colleague and friend, but you have been a real mentor to me, right, in the feedlot nutrition space, especially me coming in as a fresh PhD who, didn't have a lot of applied feedlot background, and drug me to the meetings and things like that, since you're an extrovert and I'm not, and I super appreciated.
We threw you right into a research project that was pretty impactful. When you first got here.
I mean, and that was great, right? So that was some of the Power Fund work that you guys had gotten funded, and you basically said, we have a sulfur toxicity problem with the distillers and other things coming from ethanol. You're a mineral nerd. Go find a solution. And we kind of did. So that was great, thinking about how we have more forage in the diet to keep the pH from getting too low. And that really prevented some of the sulfur toxicity risks. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your impact on others as a mentor, and then maybe some of the ones who have been impactful mentors for you, because you kind of named a few people along the way for your journey who, like your person from Blackhawk, who was like, you're going here, So who have been some of the most impactful mentors to you?
Well, at Blackhawk, Dan Hogue was the judging team coach there for like 50 years. So he was one of my first mentors. And then when I went to Penn State, I actually was co-advised by Erskine Cash, who was the judging team coach, but he didn't really have a research appointment. But he had been to Michigan State and in feedlot nutrition as well, and Harold Harpster. And the basic research that I did was actually in Paul Wongsness' lab. And Paul he was my official PhD thesis advisor because Harold was an assistant professor, and they could, because I was a PhD student, they had to co-advise. But in his lab, that's where we did all the hormone work and blood work and that type of thing. But Harold still had a very close relationship with Danny Fox. And so even during grad school and after grad school, I considered Danny Fox to be a mentor to me. I know when in the animal science meetings, when I had applied for this job, Bud Ewing was the department head at the time, and Bud came to my seminar, and Danny was in the room, and he threw me a couple softballs for questions. So that was helpful. The other mentor, a couple other mentors from an extension standpoint that I would point out. One would be Don Gill from Oklahoma State. He and Gary Kuhl had positions much like mine. They were a little more, farther along, and I learned a lot from both of those people in terms of how to do extension feedlot work, and so that was very beneficial to me. And then my partner in crime for about 25 years, Daryl Strobing. We did a lot of windshield time, going to extension meetings through the years. And so he was definitely a mentor to me. And then the final one I'd mention is your predecessor, Alan Trenkel. I don't know what year it was, but for many years, we were the extension group at Iowa State, livestock extension, we're all in one office. But then department chair at the time thought we needed to integrate more with the research faculty. So they put me next to Alan Trenkel's office. And so I spent a lot of time with Alan Trenkel. And, he was a quiet, kind of unassuming person, but he was brilliant. And we would go to those NCC, whatever the predecessor to NCC 308 was. And he didn't really like to fly that much. So we'd drive. And so we'd get lots of windshield time. And I learned a lot about, he was a grad student under Wise Burroughs, and so I learned a lot about some of the history here. I learned a lot about basic ruminant nutrition. I also learned a lot about Lewis and Clark, because he was obsessed with the Lewis and Clark Trail. He grew up in western Nebraska on the Lewis and Clark Trail, and so he was definitely a mentor as well. So that's just a few.
Yeah. And I mean, Alan did some of the work with feeding, over 14% crude protein, right, to implanted yearlings to show that, we needed to get more protein into those animals to support kind of the optimal growth to those implanted cattle.
Yeah, it's very similar to what you've done with minerals, And the interesting thing is that kind of predated if you plugged in the growth rate of those cattle to the current NRC, it probably would have predicted 14%. But he just demonstrated that. Yeah. So cool. We were having this conversation the other day about disruptive science and how, maybe we don't have as much time now for disruptive science because it's kind of a publisher perish, like hamster wheel sort of thing, unfortunately, or like the funding model is very different. And I think that windshield time with a colleague where you can just have open conversations about things, right? Like we talk about that with grad students too, right? You get to know somebody so well personally, but just the chance to throw ideas out and get feedback and talk about all the crazy stuff. And I think that's where the opportunity to improve things continues, right? Because the likelihood of us having a technology that's going to come along and improve cattle another 20% in average daily gain is probably pretty low. But we can have lots of things where we might improve things 1 or 2 or 3 or 4%, and we could just kind of pile those up. Yeah. What interesting story as an example. He told me this story about Wise Burroughs when he was developing the metabolizable protein system, and a lot of people may not be aware, but that he also developed metabolizable amino acid requirements as part of that. And so he was using, one of those digital calculators to manually calculate the amino acid requirements for cattle. And there, was several steps that he was going through. And at that time, programmable calculators, the TI 59s were, it was kind of before personal computers, but the the programmable calculators were something that were out there. And Alan, was a grad student at the time and said, Dr. Burroughs, I can develop a program for you that would, cut the amount of time that you spend to do this, by 80%. And Wise looked at him and said, if you did that, I wouldn't have time to think.
So true.
So I thought that was interesting.
So
that was
true.
his form of meditation, was punching the calculator.
I like it. But I mean, there's a ton of value in that, right? Like sometimes we just need to slow down and have the time to think, and that's hard. All right. Well, we've reached the point of our podcast where we're ready for our final 3 questions. So are you ready for these? All right. Okay. So question number 1, what is your favorite beef resource?
Yeah, that's a good, of course it's the Iowa Beef Center website, right?
Obviously.
But we do work really hard to try to keep that up to date. But I look a lot of places. I do try to set some time aside to I do read the applied journals. I do look at animal science, but I really keep up to date with the popular press too, because I want to know what everyone else is talking about now. And so that may lead me down to other resources, but I don't think I can just name just one that I follow routinely.
All right, that's fair. Okay, question number 2. What is your favorite non-beef resource or what's a book not related to beef that you're reading right now? I should know these questions, but apparently I don't.
I'll tell you one that I read last summer, and it was part of a book club that on an extension committee that I was on, and it's called Culture Renovation, and it talks about developing improving culture in companies or within your work life and that type of thing. It was very good.
Excellent. I always love a good book club. That's great. Okay, final question. What is a trait of someone that you admire that has allowed them to be successful?
This is just what immediately comes to mind. But my dad's 90th birthday is coming up in a couple of weeks, and we're going to have a party for him. We're going to go visit him. But my dad is, and I don't know if this made him successful as a human being, maybe not so much as a farmer, but he's the kindest, most humble person I've ever known, and I have a lot of respect for that.
And he's a heck of an artist, right?
He's a very good artist. Yeah, he actually majored in art in college, and he's in the veterans home in LaSalle, Illinois, and he continues to do oil paintings today. So
Dan was showing off his granddaughter's artwork in the lunchroom yesterday in Kildee, and we decided that talent must have skipped a few generations.
Yeah, I didn't receive any of that talent. I can assure you that.
Well, Dan, this has been really great. We appreciate your time coming on the show today, and I get the benefit of your wisdom every day in the office, and it's nice to get to share that with our listeners here today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.